All right, hello everyone and welcome. We are doing a panel today on GitOps. The title is Why GitOps? So we're going to be discussing a whole bunch of topics related to the practice of GitOps and the motivations for it. So my name is Dan Lorenc. I'm the chair of the Continuous Delivery Foundation TOC, and I'm a software engineer at Google. I have a bunch of awesome panelists here that I'm going to let introduce themselves. Dan Garfield, do you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Dan Garfield. I am the Chief Open Source Officer at Codefresh. I'm also one of the chairs and one of the founders of the GitOps Working Group. So excited to chat about GitOps.
All right, Tracy Ragan.
I am Tracy, the CEO of DeployHub. I'm also a board member of the CDF. I'm a board member rep. I also run an open source community called Ortelius that is an incubating project at the CDF, and I'm super excited about GitOps, like many people.
Awesome. And Cornelia.
All right, I think that leaves me. I'm Cornelia Davis. I am the CTO at Weaveworks. Weaveworks refers to itself as the GitOps company, and so I think we'll talk a little bit more about where that came from in just a moment. My background is I've been in the industry for about 30 years. I've been working on developer platforms for about the last 10 years. Prior to Weaveworks, which I've been here for almost a year and a half, I was at Pivotal where I first worked on Cloud Foundry, and then later on worked on Kubernetes-based developer platforms, but always from the focus of developer enablement and developer self-serve. I'm also an author. I wrote a book called Cloud Native Patterns, which is targeted at the application developer and architect. And I'm part of the CNCF Technical Oversight Committee as well.
Awesome. Well, let's jump in right off of that one. You mentioned Weaveworks is known as the GitOps company. And I think it's correct that Weaveworks coined that term originally. Do you want to give us a quick history lesson there, where it came from?
Yeah, sure. So quick history lesson. So yes, I do believe, I don't think anybody's ever like suggested otherwise, but my founder, one of my co-founders and CEO, Alexis Richardson, coined the term. And the way this story goes, this was before my time at Weaveworks. Weaveworks was not originally a GitOps company. It was originally around networking for container-based environments and things like that. Went through a number of evolutions, and it had an observability project. It was the founder of Cortex as well, which is another CNCF project. And we were running that as a SaaS service. And long story short, we had an outage. And we were able to recover from that outage. It was a complete, total outage of the SaaS service. We were able to recover from that in about 45 minutes. And the reason we were able to recover from that was because of what turned out to be these GitOps principles that we'll talk about throughout the conversation. We had a complete representation of the desired state of the system, and we had the right kind of automation that could make it so. And so all we needed to do was point that to new infrastructure, and it came back up. And that was a big aha moment. It was that our engineers that were running the SaaS service had put into place these practices because they saw value in them and found value in them. And it was that aha moment where we realized that this combination of Git with reconciling automation, with convergent automation, really had tremendous power. And that's where GitOps came from. And because it's a little bit of a misnomer, because the ops part is just important as the Git, and we tend to over-rotate on the Git part of GitOps, but that's where the term came from.
It's interesting to hear it came from averting a potential disaster. I was just there myself last week when it wasn't a real production system, but I ran kube control delete on the wrong cluster and had to quickly scramble and had a moment of panic to find out what cluster I was in, and I got everything restored because it was all in a Git repository. Tanner and Tracy, what were your first experiences with GitOps?
Tracy, go ahead.
So I've just begun seeing GitOps sort of show up over the course of the last few years, but my first kind of exposure to this kind of technology really came from infrastructure as code. When we started playing with, spinning up environments and having an operator that lived outside of a cluster and was able to define your infrastructure really, really quickly. And for a small company, we found that to be extremely helpful because having somebody sit and do things in a very declarative way or imperative way was not an option.
And reading That original blog post by Alexis, I think it was called Operations by Pull Request, was the first one where he talked about it. And it put it in a really succinct, clear way. I mean, we've been doing this stuff for years, right? We've been storing our stuff in Git. Infrastructure as code has been huge. We've been following all these patterns, consistently. And so having it kind of put and packaged in that way where it all felt like it was part of one specific paradigm, that was really valuable. And so we started building on top of that and figuring out, like, how do we do this with like a canary release? And how do we do this, at scale? Like, what does that look like? And I've kind of, as part of the history, I've had some discussions with people who have been in the industry, a long time and have been doing similar things for a long time. And they kind of came out and were like, you young upstarts with your fancy words. This is, we've been doing this a long time. I invented this 15 years ago. Why are you talking about GitOps as if it's a new thing? And so I thought a lot about that and what the difference is. And I think that people like Henry Ford wasn't the first person to invent the car. There were a bunch of people that invented the car. They built cars, but what he did was he built an assembly line and made it so that cars were accessible to everybody. And I think that where GitOps started and where now it's going, especially with the work that's happening, is to make it accessible and repeatable and easy for everybody to do. And so that stage, I mean, that's why we're talking about it today, is because GitOps is getting to a point and the tools are getting to a point where it's easily accessible by everybody. And it's not just, here's some principles and you've got a roadmap and get 5 engineers together and you go figure out how to implement all this stuff. It's really getting streamlined into something straightforward, and the tools are maturing to a place where everybody can use it.
So I think you were getting charged with being a hipster. You didn't use the term, but you're being charged with being a hipster.
That's right.
Were you doing XML and SVN 15 years ago?
Oh, I was. I was doing XML, not SVN.
Okay, so I think one of the other big trends we've seen, and since this is the Continuous Delivery Foundation, is people trying to integrate GitOps into a CD pipeline. Is that the only way to do GitOps? Do you think it's possible to do GitOps without doing continuous delivery, or is there some kind of benefit to combining them? I'll start with you, Tracy.
So definitions are important, right? GitOps, if you think about what GitOps is in relation to the continuous delivery pipeline, it's really the continuous deployment phase of the continuous delivery pipeline. And it is an amazing way to get to continuous deployment. And in Dan Garfield's analogy of, Henry Ford and his assembly line, we are doing what we need to do to create a repeatable process. And that's the heart of having a GitOps operator and being able to check everything into a Git repository and let the GitOps operator reference the repository to determine what the state is. But it's not a continuous delivery. It isn't, it's not orchestrating testing. It's not orchestrating a CI build. It's not doing any of that. It's doing what it needs to do to make sure that we have a true, repeatable, continuous deployment process that the deployment at dev is done the same as test as the same as prod. We have not achieved this in continuous delivery, really. Some people have, and there are tools out there that are making that happen. But in terms of really creating a repeatable process, I think the ideas around GitOps has the most promise to get us to a continuous deployment state. But it's not continuous delivery. And there is, and you'll hear me talking about this all the time, one of the challenges I think of GitOps is that it does not fit well into a CD pipeline because you have a human that needs to create a pull request. So we have to address that in the CD pipeline. And we have to address the number of YAML files that are required to maintain a GitOps model. I talk about it being a human scaling problem, not a cluster scaling problem, because you can scale it as big as you want. But we do have to look at how it's going to fit into the CD pipeline, and it's discussion that we should be having as companies begin to embrace this kind of technology and understand that it is a doorway for a very consistent continuous deployment method.
Yeah, I mean, if I could, I'd love to interject and add a little bit to that. There's so much to unpack. You said an awful lot there. But the way that I sometimes think of it is I think of what you're referring to as continuous delivery. And again, I think that there isn't one way that people use the term continuous delivery, but in the way that you are using the term, I think of the kind of continuous delivery pipeline as this horizontal thing that says, all right, I've got various stages of my software delivery lifecycle. I've got my dev stage, my testing stage, my user acceptance testing, my staging, and then my production. And you're controlling a great deal of the gates that need to be gone through, the things that need to be satisfied, the conditions that need to be met as you go through that. And I think what you're saying, Tracy, is that within one of those, then we have a consistent way, kind of going downward. We have a consistent way across all of these different stages to then realize things into that environment. And that's where we can consistently apply these GitOps practices. Of course, some people consider taking things from Git out into the into say Kubernetes as part of the delivery process. So I don't think we can work through kind of that definitional thing here on this panel. But you're right, that goes down there. But the last thing that I want to say is that there is, in my mind, no such thing as the continuous deployment operator or the GitOps operator, because GitOps is really about not only the watching Git and then bringing things into, let's say, the Kubernetes store, the etcd store, but it's also how do you relate that to the actual running state of the things that you have expressed in that Git repository. So you have to link it together with these other operators that are making it so. And so there's this kind of pair between I've got to get things into my runtime environment, and then I've got operators that operate on that. Not until it's a running pod, if you're doing containers, is it actually in operations. So GitOps is about managing that. It's not just about Git to Kubernetes.
And the thing that I think, Dan, you brought up earlier was that you accidentally had this issue where you had deleted files in a production cluster, right? And not to pick on you, but I think from a GitOps standpoint, and the point of GitOps, I don't think is to be a gatekeeper. Like, it's not to say like, you're not doing GitOps and I'm going to beat you over the head with it. But it's maybe a spectrum of things that you adopt and you get more GitOpsy as you go along. But ideally, you don't have people with connections to a production cluster like after it's set up, maybe even ever. I mean, ideally, every single operation is happening through Git. And so I think we were going to get to that point from a CD standpoint where, no, we don't have keys to production. What are you talking about? Like, it's not sitting on somebody's laptop. Like, that's crazy. Like, what if their laptop, someone walks by and commits something, like, or does, applies something, and now all of a sudden it's out of state, and what's going on? And years ago, a company I'm familiar with had an issue where a developer's laptop got hacked, and they had access to dozens of client websites, and suddenly all those client websites had basically were spamming and cookie injecting on people and spying on people because they'd gone through this developer's laptop. And like, that's the kind of stuff where, from a security perspective, we can eliminate all that stuff by following this process and relying on it. And I'm not saying that we're 100% there yet. I think we're getting close, but there are certain situations where you might need to escalate. But ideally, you are able to accomplish and get to continuous delivery with GitOps because it is a pattern that lets you do it. And so many deployments that they're happening today. I mean, what percentage of deployments are happening in a fully automated fashion? It's shockingly low, right? It's very, very low compared to what we would like it to be. So this is, I think, super critical for the productivity and sanity of everybody present.
And by the way, that delete case that you just talked about, there is something that GitOps delivers on today. If you had your system set up as GitOps, when you did that delete, GitOps would have restored it for you.
Your operator would have picked it up.
The operator would have said, wait a minute, there's a difference now between what we have in Git, and you could set up the policy that says, you know what, if you drift from that, then restore it back to what's in Git. Git is the source of truth. So you wouldn't have had to scramble. GitOps would have scrambled for you.
Yeah, I really like that term, and the operator term. We talked about it a bunch of times because I think it really encapsulates all the manual tasks that a human operator would have been doing in the past. Thankfully, my case wasn't a production system. Nobody is silly enough to let me near one at all, in particular my laptop. But you started to touch on some other, I guess, pretty important things in the news a lot lately, Dan, with security. Do you think GitOps plays an important role here in improving security as people roll things out to production?
Yeah, I think that it's critical. And security is often thought of as things that we keep out of production, but security is just as much about getting things into production because the software that you have deployed in production right now has vulnerabilities. I mean, it's statistically certain that you have vulnerabilities in production today. You don't know about them. Maybe nobody knows about them. Ideally, nobody knows, right? But as patches come out to the software that you're relying on, you're going to want to get that patched really quick, right? And the best way to do that is if you're using GitOps and you're using a standard, protocol for rolling things out, you're going to be able to easily commit those changes, get them staged, get them into production, in seconds or minutes rather than hours or days or weeks. So security is about deploying faster. If you want to be more stable and more secure, you're going to have to find a way to deploy faster for sure. And it's also about auditability going back on the other end where drift detection is a key element here. If somebody is able to gain access to your environment and start making changes, well, with drift detection, they're going to be just constantly getting rebooted out because it's going to be noticed that the state is not the one that's desired and defined in Git. Now, ideally, you got to go patch that hole so they can't keep getting in. But it's super critical from a security standpoint. And to be effective from the security standpoint, you have to be effective from the productivity standpoint, which is great because that means it's a win-win if you can figure it out.
And I think we all have to keep in mind as we were thinking about what GitOps is that we are removing the human element. You're not tweaking your production or your testing or your development environment by a command line or some other kind of a interactive experience because you're defining a state and that state is being managed by Git. So as Cornelia pointed out, if you tweak it manually, the GitOps operator is going to say, yeah, that's out of sync. I'm going to bring it back to the state that's defined. So by doing that, you eliminate the external hacker that is tweaking things that they shouldn't be, even if they are somebody who works for the company. This is one of the cultural things that will change. There are so many people I talk to that are like, but I'm so used to using the command line. I'm so used to doing this manually. How do I let go of that control? And that's what is required when you move from something that's imperative to something that's declarative. And that's a shift that we're going to be seeing not only in this GitOps movement, we're going to begin seeing that shift in many places. The more we can define it in state and then just manage some kind of declarative script to define that state, the more careful we will be as we move fast, as we go fast, as you said, Dan. Yeah. It's taking the human element out.
Yeah, there's a phrase that I really like. I think that describes that kind of captures what you just described there, Tracy, which is that Git is the interface to operations. So you're right. People used to use CLIs, or they used the vSphere console, or they used the AWS console. Those were their interfaces to operations. And now Git becomes the interface to operations. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have some continuous delivery tool that is scripting Git, but Git is the interface that it's scripting. And by scripting, I air quotes around that. So you're right. You might still be eliminating the human, but the interface to operations is now through Git.
This is actually something we've talked about even in terms of like, if I built a tool to simplify my management, I wanted to be able to use a UI. what should that UI actually do? Well, it should make changes in Git or make a pull request automatically or something like that for you. Like if you need to have a UI, then that it should actually go through Git so that it can be reconciled finally. And even making it so that one of the patterns we're seeing a lot is people getting rid of manual configuration creation and they're using generated configuration. So like if I make a change to my application repo, this kicks off an automated process that generates the manifests, which are opened onto a pull request onto the infrastructure repo, which then goes through the GitOps process. So you eliminate a lot of the possibilities where problems occur, and especially downtime can occur. Like AWS, how many times have they gone down because somebody fat fingered a change, while they're connected to production? Too many, far too many, right? But you can get rid of that because to this point, Git is the interface of operations.
Yeah, and automating that, the front end of Git is, I think, is where my strongest interest in, because when we do that, what you just described, then we are really tightening up the process because somebody didn't copy the wrong SHA, right? Something as simple as that is where the weakness is. And the more we can automate that and lock it down so that it just happens for you, the closer we're getting to a really clean way of managing our deployments, regardless of what environment it's going to.
Okay, well, I'm sold at this point. GitOps can make it faster, more secure, more productive. So let's pretend you're a company just hearing about all of this for the first time somehow, and you want to get started with it. Are there some tips? Are there incremental approaches people can take before jumping all the way in? Do you have any kind of advice you give to people in that situation? Who wants to start?
So I'll go ahead and jump in. There was enough of a pause. We've been talking about it quite a bit. We've been talking, and Tracy's emphasized it several times, as kind of declarative, non-imperative automation. So it's the declarative state automation that is convergent, non-imperative. And it turns out that there's a really cool system out there that already has these foundational principles. It's called Kubernetes. So the way that you're deploying containerized applications, and that, by the way, containerized applications is just use case one for Kubernetes, but it's pretty darn mature at this point. We've got that reconciling automation that's happening, that the replica set controller, the deployment controller, that make it so. And we've got declarative configuration that expresses what you want running there. So now you add some additional reconciling automation. What Tracy was referring to as the GitOps operator. And I was saying, well, it's GitOps, there's more than one operator, but you've got some operators that handle getting it from Git into Kubernetes. And then Kubernetes already has these reconciling controllers, these convergent controllers that actually create the pods. Because you get that for free, the declarative and the reconciling controllers for free with Kubernetes, that's a great place to start your GitOps journey. Because you don't have to build that convergent non-imperative automation. It's already there. And then you can leverage something like Flux, which is a CNCF project that Weaveworks creates, or Argo CD, which is another reconciling kind of mechanism for bringing things from Git into Kubernetes that's also in the CNCF. You add that, and then you're like, there, you're doing GitOps. Now there's some best practices, and you start to learn those, but that's an outstanding place to start because you get so much of the equation for free by just using Kubernetes.
Yeah, I agree. The starting with Kubernetes and the tools that were mentioned, both CNCF projects, famously Flux from Weaveworks, Argo CD, which is something that Codefresh works quite a bit on. Those are really perfect for Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is ideal for it. But it's worth calling out too that Kubernetes is by no means the end destination of GitOps. These principles we really think are going to apply to pretty much all infrastructure. And one of the reasons that AWS is involved in the GitOps working group and Azure is involved in the GitOps working group is specifically because they're looking for standards that are going to help them build better infrastructure tools that are going to work under these principles. And so as they're coming out with new ideas, new products, serverless is, obviously doing a lot of work. We can hold up a yardstick and say, hey, is this compatible with GitOps? Can you do this with GitOps? Because if you can't, we're getting behind. So this is the right place to start, but it's by no means where we'll end up.
And going back to what Cornelia said about the containerized application, that is the place you should start. When you start decomposing your containerized application, you're going to find out that breaking up is really hard to do. And you need to have a strategy for doing that. Now, what I'm starting to see some mistakes, because we work a lot in the microservices area, it's our focus, is that we are seeing a lot of application-based deployment files and YAML files. They don't break it up into application, each microservice having its own. So when you move from a containerized application to start decomposing your applications, you really have to sit down, get on the whiteboard, and start looking at all of the parts and pieces that have to be touched. Are we going to go to a poly repo? And if you go to a poly repo, you're going to have a lot more places that you have to check in those YAML files. So it is an architectural change, and you should consider it an architectural change and address it as an architectural change. And don't just rush in, because you'll have a lot of pieces and parts you didn't put together right.
Cool. Something interesting, I think a couple of people said in that last section, is GitOps doesn't stop with Kubernetes. What are some of the strangest places you've seen it? I can think of a few, like how the Kubernetes community and different open source communities are using GitOps to manage calendars now, or like you can change the meeting invitations in a Git repo and it gets reconciled to the shared calendar everyone has. It's awesome to do stuff that way. Have you seen any strange or fun or new and insightful spots GitOps is popping up?
No, but we're thinking about how to do that for the CD pipelines, right? You should be able to, declare what you want in your pipeline, and then you're going to have events and sequences. You're not going to have a pipeline anymore. You're going to have a sequence, right? And the events will determine that, and you could declare that for your pipeline. Check it into Git, and your pipeline would run off of it. Now that would be really cool. I'm hoping that we see that sooner than later.
Some of the use cases that I've seen are there are a lot of kind of policy related things. So it could be the groups that you've defined in your LDAP system, and you're using LDAP as kind of your central place to come up with your groups and who has which roles and all that, and then propagating that out into the systems that then apply those policies. That's something that I'm starting to see pretty commonly. Doing things around OPA is kind of a more general, like GitOps and your Rego rules. Those are some of the types of things that we're definitely seeing it applied to in many scenarios.
One of the funny conversations that we had when the GitOps working group was started is somebody came in and was like, hey, why are we using a Google Doc? Like, we should be using Git for taking notes and stuff. And we're like, well, maybe we will someday, but it's probably okay for us to do a little bit of live collaboration in a tool that's meant for it. It's not quite meant for that in that same way. But even though this is Kubernetes, I think this is a really interesting use case. Leonardo Murillo gave a really cool presentation a while ago about doing air-gapped environments. And basically what they did is they set up essentially a thumb drive that had a Git repo on it. And then they would walk up and they plug it into the device, and it would go through the reconciliation loop with a reconciler that was on. Then in this case, it was Kubernetes on the edge. It was in, I think, 5G towers or something, but they're air gapped. And it would then do the reconciliation there. Now, even though it requires walking a USB drive up, it's still GitOps, and it still actually simplifies the process that they would go through, because before that, if they wanted to update dozens or thousands of nodes and people had to walk up, they would have like a handbook of instructions that everybody needed to follow. And if you don't follow it exactly, or you run into some issue, suddenly now you have divergence across all these nodes, and you have to have really super skilled technicians to deal with that. In this case, now it's easier. They can prepare a simple thumb drive. They can just copy the code over when it's ready, and then they can just send it out, and everybody can just go and plug it in, and they're good to go. And that's a pretty wild, interesting use case.
I can just imagine how much easier it makes debugging later when you just have to check what version your air-gapped system is at by looking at the Git commit, and instead of having to check the state of every single system inside of there. Cool. That was a good transition, I guess, because you started to mention the CNCF GitOps SIG, the special interest group. GitOps is evolving. What are some of the things going on in the GitOps SIG, and how is it helping out? Why should people get involved there?
Yeah, I'll start there if that's all right.
Sure.
So the GitOps working group we launched it in partnership, Codefresh, Weaveworks, AWS, Azure. Am I forgetting something?
GitHub.
Oh, GitHub, of course. Launched this just at the end of last year. And the goal was really, let's put together standards and best practices and principles for what GitOps is and how to do it. And let's make something that's inclusive and streamlined and simplified, because we've seen GitOps start to come into discussions where people are saying, well, I'm doing GitOps. No, you're not doing GitOps. This is GitOps. That's not GitOps. And there's confusion about what it means. And so, for example, one of the things that many people don't realize is that GitOps, the principles, and they're not completely finished yet. They're actually being drafted right now. So please, we would encourage anybody listening, come get involved in the community. There are dozens of people working on this from all kinds of different companies. But one of the principles is this idea of closed loop reconciliation. So having an operator that is looking for changes and trying to pull them and apply them onto the infrastructure. That's something that even if you've been doing infrastructure as code, you're probably not doing that yet. And there are a number of other principles in there that are being worked on that are incredibly valuable once you start using them. So creating this standard, making it easy for people to use, showing which tools are compliant or support that standard, like Flux, like Argo, and then helping vendors understand, hey, if you want to make your tool GitOps friendly, these are the principles that you're going to need to follow, and even providing a pattern, different patterns and community contributed patterns that people can look at to see, hey, if I'm doing AWS and I want to deploy serverless infrastructure, what's the best way to do that? Having things that people can contribute and view that way. So there's essentially the GitOps working group, which is under the SIG app delivery of the CNCF. And we're working on a standard that is called Open GitOps, which is a project under the CNCF. And Cornelia, also huge part of the formation of that group. So Cornelia, by all means, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would add that's 100% correct, and the reason for these standards is not just for standards' sake. It's not just because we want to take some purist high horse. It's that there are certain characteristics, there are certain benefits that are realized only if you do things in a certain way. And so we don't want to water down GitOps to be something where somebody says, oh, well, I'm doing GitOps, but wait a minute, I can't do recovery. I can't do disaster recovery in the story that I told you at the very beginning, because I haven't protected against drift detection. And my runtime environment doesn't match what's in Git because I wasn't constantly reconciling. I didn't have a convergent system. Well, then you're not doing GitOps. You're doing Git plus automation, but you're not doing GitOps. So you don't realize this business benefit of disaster recovery. And so that's what we're aiming to do with the GitOps working group. And these principles in particular is to identify the essential principles that yield the kind of results that we want to deliver with these practices.
Cool. So what I'm hearing is Git plus automation is just sparkling Git automation, and for real GitOps, you need it only comes from a specific region of the CNCF GitOps working group, and we're going to define those standards and make it easy for everybody.
Yep.
It is the champagne.
If you're just doing Git plus automation, you're only halfway there, and you're probably living on a prayer.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and for companies like DeployHub, we need to see those, we need to understand those standards. We need to have standard protocols. We need to have standard integrations. And so it will be essential as GitOps is embraced by more companies and we start building it into these CD pipelines, that we have a community we can go to and say, hey, can we solve this problem?
Awesome. Well, thanks. I think that wraps up our time here today. So now we'll switch over to live questions. Thanks everyone for coming.